Okay, good morning everyone. So, just before we start, it's always good to learn, so thank you, Ivan, for your question. Just to summarize very quickly, because it's not the topic of today's shiur. So today is one of the minor fast days, we call them. And the reason for it is because we actually start a period now called the 3 weeks, which is a period of mourning. We don't have weddings, we don't play music if we can help it, and things like that. Because during 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, in the case of the first temple, we know that both temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av, which is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks Thursday, meaning today 3 weeks, which is a bit more major, and that's the day that both temples in Jerusalem were destroyed. That was a very significant tragedy, and Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews went into exile. The first exile was the Babylonian exile, the second was the Roman exile. And 3 weeks before that, on the 17th of Tammuz, which is today, the Romans, particularly in the second temple, the Romans there was a siege around Jerusalem, which was surrounded by a wall, as we know, and they broke through the wall. So they penetrated the wall on the 17th of Tammuz, and that was the beginning of the end. They fought a war, a very bad war, and they made their way to the Temple Mount and eventually destroyed the temple. There were other things that happened. This is how it works, Jewish history. Sometimes certain days are just the days that things happen. And the 17th of Tammuz, other things that happened, including going all the way back to Moses in the story of the golden calf. So the golden calf was also served on the 17th of Tammuz. And that's the day that Moses came down the mountain, saw what was happening, and he smashed the first set of tablets. Right, the Luchot, the Ten Commandments that were engraved by God actually and were given to him to take to the Jewish people and keep. They were smashed because the Jews were serving the golden calf. So that was one of the first thing that happened on the 17th of Tammuz. But as the Rambam tells us, all of these things are only temporary, because there will come a time, please God soon, that Mashiach will come, and all the days will see the deep good that will come out of all of this, and will once again be a nation with strength and glory, and so on. And the Rambam says that all these fast days will be transformed to days of happiness, days of Yom Tov, which in the 17th of Tammuz actually is, this is a topic of a longer discussion, which we're not going to get into, but it's interesting, the 17th of Tammuz, the number 17 in Hebrew is the same, the gematria, the same numerical value as Tov, which is good. So there's good that's going to come out of all this, which is always how we face things like this. But in the meantime, this is 3 weeks of the year where we do pay attention to the fact that the temples were destroyed, and by extension, many other tragedies that befell the Jewish people up until today, we understand are all really an extension of those original tragedies. So that's the quick answer to us today. Okay, talking of which, I just want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, this is the last series of the last lecture of the term. Normally we take a 2-week break around this time of the year, but we can take a 3-week break, because in 3 weeks from now we're not going to have a lecture because it's Tisha B'Av. So the new series, the new series will start on 30th of July. That's spelled incorrectly. Sorry, 30th of July. 30th, yeah, 30. I am working on a very exciting topic, but I need to fine-tune it before I send it out, so I will do that. Last week I'm not going to go through a whole review, but we just did we did a session on triage, the halachic and Jewish view of triage, essentially, and we just learned about different kinds of principles, which is like, for example, what's closer comes first, or a relative comes first. Temporary life versus long-term life we discussed, and then what happens when they conflict with each other, which one takes precedence. And the main point of the dilemma we talked about last week was the idea of lefanenu. Lefanenu means the choice that we're making, or the crisis that we're responding to, if it takes precedence, has to be a reality. It has to be something that's there. And the question was what the definition of that is, and that went back to that question at a hospital. If it's just a statistical certainty that it's going to happen, does that mean it's like it's happened? And that was the different views that came out. the different options and so on that we talked about last week. Okay. This week we're going to do something different. I mean, also in the same sort of area. We're actually going to touch on two things, you'll see why, which are seemingly sort of unrelated. The one has to do with taking risks and level of risk, and the other has to do with consent in cases of medical intervention or medical procedures, medical treatments. Now, I want to clarify something. Whatever we're going to say today is not meant as a halachic clarity. So please don't learn anything from it on a practical level. It's just about understanding the issues, because everything is very specific and very detailed, and all depends when and how and who and so on. It's just very, very general. And part of what I'm going to share with you today, I'm actually basing on a chapter in a book by Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, who, if you remember from last week, he's still alive. He's in Bnei Brak. He's quite an expert on medical ethics in that field. He was the one who gave the idea last week about putting the ventilator on a time clock. If you remember, we talked about that at the end. It was actually his thing. Anyway, he's got some interesting. He's got quite a number of books on different medical and health issues, and some of it comes from him. Okay. So it has to do with it starts with a particular question of a woman that came to a plastic surgeon for a certain treatment. The treatment, and this is important, the treatment was not because she was in danger. The treatment was purely cosmetic. And then the treatment ended up harming her in a certain way. I don't know, it doesn't specify what it was, but it hurt her in different ways. And it turns out that what happened to her is potentially one of the risks of that treatment. And the surgeon had never informed her of those risks. Right? So the question was, can she sue him? Like, can she ask for damages? Or, in other words, was he supposed to really tell her all the risks associated with the things? Now, there's two issues that need to be discussed here, and each have their own ramifications and own discussion around it. One is, in a medical procedure, do you always need the patient's consent? That's number one. And do you always need to explain exactly what all the risks are? And another topic which is also related to this question, and we'll go into a little bit, is level of risk. And that's actually a topic which is related not only to medical procedures, but related to everyday life, as we'll soon see. Now, if you go, I went on, just out of interest, I went on the New South Wales Health website, and went and asked the following question. We say we have to tell everyone we need consent. I mean, today you can die on the operating table if you haven't signed the paper. They're not going to do anything. Right? That's where it works here. I mean, like the first thing you come into for a procedure, doesn't matter how minor. I just went in, I have a kidney stuff that I had a couple of months ago, and the first thing they do, like, do you have your signed paper? Right? Because it's a very litigious world, especially in America, but even here, I suppose, and people have to cover themselves, and the first thing they want to know is, have you given full consent for this thing? Okay. But it goes into an interesting thing. How about if I don't give consent? Can a patient refuse treatment? Okay, so let's say I don't give consent. Am I allowed to not give consent if I need the operation? So I'll read you what it says on the website. An adult patient with capacity has the right to refuse any medical treatment, even when that decision may lead to their death. That's interesting. This right exists even when the reasons for making the choice seem irrational or unknown or even non-existent. The right to refuse treatment extends to all medical treatment, including, but not limited to, ventilation, cardio resuscitation, dialysis, antibiotics, artificial, everything, right? Now, it's true, like consent to medical treatment, a refusal of treatment also has to be freely given, specific and informed. Okay, so they have to at least have the knowledge, right? Now, of course, efforts should be made to ascertain the reasons and so on. And sometimes there's they talk, because that's a big thing, cultural sensitivity and all kinds of different things, and they should all be accommodated where possible. For example, they give give an example about J witnesses, that they don't have anything with blood in it, therefore we've got to try to find alternatives for them, which is all nice and true. But the bottom line is, the law is that a person can actually refuse treatments. which is very interesting. Even if it's going to harm them, and even if it's going to die from it. In Jewish law, that is not the case, right? Because in Jewish law, we are actually, it's very interesting, we're actually bound by certain principles, by certain moral principles, which includes the concept, as we've talked about many times in other areas, that actually the notion that I own my body and own my life and own my destiny is just simply not true. I don't. In Judaism. It's a God-given gift, it belongs to God, everything belongs to God, and therefore our job is to take care of the gift that God has given us. That life that we have is a gift that was given to us by God, right? And we need to take care of it, and therefore we have to safeguard it. Now, that doesn't mean there are sometimes in halakha, very complicated cases, where administration of treatment is a choice, right? And that's in end of life and intervention and things like that, where there are certain cases where halakha does allow sometimes the treatment versus risks, like, that kind of thing, where we do allow, but generally speaking, there's an obligation to be healed. Now, it's an interesting thing because this goes back to a very famous verse in the Torah, where the Torah tells about someone who's unwell, etc. There's a whole scenario that's spoken about in the Chumash, and the Torah says, "V'rapo yirapeh," which means, you go to a doctor, and the doctor will surely will administer a healing experience, right? And the Talmud says, because this was in the early Jewish writers, this was a theological discussion. If everything comes from God, and everything is hashgacha pratita, we always talk about it, and everything is by divine providence. So he made me sick. So who said I have permission to go to a doctor, right? So actually, it's interesting. It goes both ways. We actually need explicit permission to actually seek medical intervention because we're interfering with God's plan. The answer is that we're not. God gives us sickness for whatever reason He decides. He also tells us that we have to do what we have to do to become healthy and to protect the health, and therefore there's an explicit verse in the pasuk which tells us that there's permission for the doctor to heal. We have to go to the doctor, and because there's permission, it becomes an obligation. Why does it become an obligation? Because we have another verse in the Torah called "V'nishmartem me'od nafshoteichem," that we actually have to take care of our health. That is an obligation, right? We have to take it. Therefore, if we have a medical issue, we actually need to seek medical treatment, or medical intervention, or medical advice, whatever, or medicine, whatever the case is, right? Which, by the way, goes to a whole other topic maybe one day we'll do, which is fascinating, about which medical intervention do you choose. For example, are you allowed to ignore conventional medicine for alternative healing, right? Which is a fascinating topic. Do you know what the answer is? Can you ignore conventional medicine? First of all, what and how do you define conventional medicine, right? So it's very, very, it's a very fascinating topic. I'll just tell you very briefly, basically what the idea is. And I have to say, this was discussed a lot in COVID time. COVID didn't help because it actually eroded the trust in conventional medicine to a great degree, which was problematic and is still problematic. But nevertheless, the basic view is that you have to go by the science of the time, because don't forget, conventional medicine changes from generation to generation, right? Conventional medicine in the Talmudic time is different to conventional medicine today. But that's not a problem. The problem is that you're supposed to rely on the science of the time, to the best of their knowledge. What does science of the time mean? That itself needs to be defined. It normally means the majority view of what people think is good for you and not good for you. One isn't permitted to go down the route of alternative medicine. I'm saying, again, whatever I'm saying today is more general. There's lots of specifics, so don't take it as ruling. But the basic idea is you're allowed to pursue alternative medicine, but not in place of conventional medicine. Okay, unless there are exceptions and there are reasons, but that's the basic idea. So where was I? Yes. So therefore, you have to seek intervention. And therefore, when someone is in danger or in danger of being very sick, not even in danger of dying necessarily, right? One has to have the procedure. One has to seek the intervention, right? We don't have a right to refuse. Okay? So therefore, if someone absolutely needs an operation, for example, this relates also to the obligation of the doctor to reveal all the risks. Because if there's no other choice, the risks actually become, unless it's a very big risk of more than 50%, but if it's just a normal risk, it becomes irrelevant almost, right? So especially if it's a minimal risk. So the truth is in halakha, this is what he writes. I mean, it's nice to be informative and it's nice to communicate and all that's true. But if there was not the case that we talked about, because that's a cosmetic surgery case, it's different. But if there was a case of a medicine or a procedure or any medical intervention that was absolutely necessary, and there were risks attached to it, you don't necessarily have to reveal all the risks. So the person just has to do it. It goes even as far as that if in halakha, I don't know how you do this practically, but in halakha, if someone refuses medical treatment, there's been stories in the news like when certain people have religious beliefs, they won't take things with blood in it or pig in it or whatever the case is, and they or whatever the case is, they decide they're not putting their child into a very, very necessary medical procedure. In halakha, you can actually force them. You can force the person to do it for themselves or for children. You force the parents, right? Because we don't own our own body, we don't own our own experience, and we need to do what is halakhically correct. Assuming that what we're talking about doing is an halakhic obligation. Again, that's another discussion about which medicine to follow and all that. Right? Now, again, this is, and it can be even if the risks are clear. For example, if it's a matter of saving someone's life, right? If there's a procedure that will if the person doesn't do it, I'm not a doctor, so I can't really give you proper examples. But if there was in a situation where a person needed a medical procedure, if he didn't or she didn't take it, they would die. But if they take it, she'll be left with a disability, let's say, or certain damage to their body. You still force the person to do it because you have to save a life, even if it means that the person will be left somewhat compromised, and they don't want to be left compromised. It's not their choice. It's not our choice. Not anyone's choice, right? We don't get to make that choice, which is a harsh thing, but nevertheless, that's the morality of life and the morality of what Torah tells us, all right? And again, it all comes back to this idea of the nishmat. We have to take care of our body, we have to take care of our health, and we're obligated to seek the things that help us. We're obligated to seek the procedures or the medicine that can help us. Now, however, in the case that we brought before, you absolutely need consent because that had nothing to do with danger, right? But I'm not suggesting when you go to the hospital you shouldn't sign the paper. I'm just saying that it's just a good idea to get consent. Anyway, but for cases where you're saving a person who's in danger, you actually don't need the consent of the patient halachically. However, if a patient is seeking intervention, if it's purely cosmetic, for example, and they will be okay, they'll live properly without it. They might want to fix something, but they're not gonna. They don't need it to live. They don't need it to survive. They don't need it to live a normal life. They'll be able to continue living a normal life, whatever they define to be as normal life. Then you can't just go ahead and do it. First of all, you can't just do the operation. You can't force the person. You actually must get consent. The person has absolute right to refuse that, right? And in addition, obviously, if there's risks, you have to tell them, right? Yep. So that's all we established. So again, if a doctor is doing a procedure that is not necessarily taking a person out of danger, it's just it'll improve their life somewhat maybe, but they're not in danger, then the person has a right to refuse that. You need to give consent, and part of that consent is you need to also reveal all the risks. However, here we go into interesting area. What level of risk do you have to reveal? Every risk? I mean, if a medicine that you get has like a 1 in a million chance of something happening, does a doctor have to reveal that? Do you have to go through every single time you take a prescription from a doctor? Does a doctor have to go through every single thing? By the way, even on the packet, they don't go every single thing. If you go on the website, you look it up, you'll find a long list of, in some rare cases, I don't know, you'll be nauseous. Or in some rare cases, you might get recurring headaches, or whatever the case is, right? But it's a minority of cases. Now, you might just be the unlucky one that gets it, but how big does the risk have to be? What does the word risk mean? So in that case, apparently the risk was like less than 1%. Did the doctor do a wrong thing by not revealing the level of risk, right? So, we have to go into the whole idea of risk, which is a very fascinating topic. And so I wanted to focus on it a little bit. We'll come back to the end. Now, it's very hard because all of these things go with percentages and how you define minimal. So again, I'm not an expert on these things. I'm not going to go through all the different exact percentages of risk, but I'm just going to give you the basic idea. And it's not to do only with, it's not only to do with being in danger or health. It's got to do with general halakha. We have a principle like this. The next part is a bit, I hope you can stomach it, it's a bit gory. I'm going to talk about shechting animals, okay? So kashrut, laws of kashrut. Because I want to just establish a principle and then show you how we use that principle in health issues. Or do we use that principle in health issues? So we have when you have kosher meat, the animal has to be, I don't know if you know all this, but animal has to be shechted properly. It's got to be slaughtered properly. Okay, so that's fine. But that's not the whole story. The reason why it's so labor intensive, there's a reason why kosher meat's a bit more expensive, because there's a lot of labor that goes into it. A couple of things have to happen before. First, it has to be kashered, all the soul, take out the blood, all that kind of stuff. But before that, parts of the animal have to be inspected to make sure that the animal has no sickness. Why? So you know the word kosher and treif, right? So the word treif actually is a borrowed term. Treif is not actually a term that is accurate when we use it for anything that's not kosher, right? Treif is a specific word in the Chumash that is used for a specific situation, and that is that an animal we have kosher animals and non-kosher animals. Then we have kosher animals, but if a kosher animal is a treifah, the word treifah actually means, let's say, a wild animal, let's say a lion attacked a cow. Okay, just for what we say, and the cow might be suffering from internal damage, which could that's actually exactly what a treifah means, right? And that internal damage means that the animal will not be able to live very long. I've forgotten exactly the term, but the animal will die shortly. If that animal gets shechted today, it is not kosher. You still can't eat it. So you might shecht an animal properly with all of its laws of shchita, but then if you discover that the animal has something wrong with it, right, that would have rendered it sick enough to die very shortly, the animal was not allowed to be shechted, or it was allowed to be shechted, but it's not an animal you can't eat, right? Now, when you learn in yeshiva, we learn for smicha, there's a whole section on this, which I wasn't very good at because I kind of in school failed biology because I just can't understand the terms and everything to do with all the anatomy of a human being. The anatomy of a cow is pretty similar, by the way. Did you know that? We're all mammals, right? Yeah. So it's very interesting. The first time I went, when I was learning for smicha, I actually went on a tour of a shchita to see how cows are shechted, right? And how they dissected and all that. And I came away with a very interesting thing that, how similar we are to animals. And sometimes we really have to reflect on what actually makes us different, right? Separate discussion. But anyway, the anatomy is very similar. So I was never very good at that. And especially, and therefore when I learned it in halakha, I wasn't very good at it either. But therefore I wouddn't go into that area at all. But, sorry? No, you can learn it. It's just not something that comes easy. I can learn. It's just not an area that I need to go into, practically speaking. It's part of Torah, part of knowledge, but, I'm going to share with you some of the knowledge now, so it turns out there's like 24 different things in the brain, in the liver, in the leg, in the heart, in the lung, all these things that could be wrong with any animal that you shecht, and statistically 1 in thousands of animals will have that disease, which means it renders it not kosher. So now the question is like this: what does that mean? Do we now have to go and dissect every single cow that's shechted before we sell it to you? The answer is no. Why? Because we have a principle in halakha that's called rov. Rov means we go by the majority, especially if it's an overwhelming majority, right? So if an overwhelming majority of animals do not contract or do not suffer from those illnesses that is described in halakha, that if we would know about them, we would render that animal not kosher, we have no obligation to check. No obligation to check, right? Because it's only a minority of animals that have that. However, We have a principle in halakha. I'm sorry, I'm just giving you a bit of technical halakha here to understand the principle. We have an idea called, there's different types of minorities. It's called a miut she'enoi matsui and a miut shematsui, which means a minority that is common, the minority is not common. So it's very, very different. We do have a principle of Judaism following majority of cases, but not always. In other words, sometimes if it's accessible to check, we should, because it depends. Because if we say, it's very different if we say in a particular disease that only 1% of animal gets it, or 10%, or even 15 or 20%. That makes it more of a common minority. It's still a minority, but it's a common minority, right? So common minorities we do need to check, which is why one of the things that does often happen in animals, and when they shecht animals, just this is interesting knowledge, not all the animals make it to the butcher because some are rendered not kosher, which then gets sold for not kosher. Because they do check the lung, because the lung often have issues with it. It's got to do with something might have pricked the lung, or even in the eating. It's a whole kinds of things, all kinds of reasons. Sometimes you discover that the lung has a growth, and that growth could be covering up a hole. All kinds of things, and that's one of the things they do check. Now, it's also only a minority of animals, but that's called a common minority, and therefore they check it. But most of the stuff they don't check. They don't open the brain, they don't open the liver. Why? Because only the stomach, around the stomach area, they check a bit, right? Why? Because that's more common minorities. It's all minority, but it's common minority. Where everything else that could go wrong with the animal, make it not kosher, is an uncommon minority. Okay, so that's how it works in halakha. So basically, we follow majority, but we do check if it's a common minority. We check just to make sure. Okay. How does that translate to health? Health. If you taking risks that are dangerous, do you just say, well, in 51% of cases this seems okay, or even 70% of cases seems okay? It's not that risky, so I'm going to do it. So we say no. Why? We have a principle in halakha that goes like this. I'll say it in Aramaic and then translate it. It's called Chamira Sakanta Me'isura, which means danger is more strict in halakha than prohibitions. Okay? So I'll tell you a fascinating piece that I once learned, where you see this so clearly. Again, it's a bit halachic, but just bear with me for a few minutes because it's quite amazing. And it's written by Tosfot. Tosfot is a commentary on the Talmud. It's not one person, not one author. It's a group of authors. They were all Rashi's grandchildren. So if you open up a page of Talmud, you'll see on the one there's Talmud in the middle. On the one side is Rashi's commentary, and the other side is Tosfot, which are all his grandchildren. Incidentally, they often argue with Rashi. Interestingly enough, right? Because when it comes to Torah learning, we don't. You don't say I don't argue with relatives. You do. You're supposed to, with love and respect, but you're supposed to. You're supposed to debate. Okay. So there's a very fascinating Talmud that's got to do with the Seder night. Okay. And it's got to do with the reason and the origin of Haroset. Okay. Now, I don't think this is so relevant today. I don't think we have this thing today. But in Talmudic times, one of the functions of Haroset and the ingredients they used to put into the Haroset was the following. Because in the Maror, I'm not sure if it was the lettuce or the grain, whatever it was, there was sometimes that you could find a particular insect, a very small insect, that could still be alive, and if you eat that insect alive, it could be fatal. It has a poison to it, right? A worm, an insect, whatever it was. Okay, sorry to be gory today, but that's just, you gotta get through the information. So, okay. However, if you dip the maror into charoset, the fumes of the charoset, used to put wine in, all kinds of stuff, would kill that insect and would render it no longer dangerous. All right? Okay, fine. Where we good? We clear? Okay. So Tosfot raises the following question. That insect, whatever it is, like all other insects, are not kosher. You can't eat insects, right? That's why we have a law in kashrut that when you have vegetables that might be infested or might have insects in it, you actually, not just because you don't like to eat insects, but also halachically, you have to actually check it first. So that's why some women in the kitchen will check, or men for that matter, We'll check lettuce, we'll check this, we'll check that. Depends on the place. Some places it's more, some places less. Whatever. Okay, there's all a body of halakha governing that. Because you're not supposed to eat. They're quite treif, right? Very treif, actually, right? So Tosfos says, I don't understand. This thing, you're going to dip the lettuce or the maror into the charaset, right? The fumes of the charaset are going to remove the danger by killing the insect. And then you're going to eat the thing. Well, in kashrut, there's no difference if the thing's alive or dead. So why are you allowed to eat it? Why don't we say no? You actually have to open it up and check it properly. Even if the insect's dead, you've got to take it out. You can't just eat it just because the danger's gone away. Right? You understand the question? So Tosfos doesn't understand the passages of the Talmud. And Tosfos says the following answer. He says, very simple. There are two issues here. One issue is danger, and the other issue is kashrut. Right? It wasn't that common to have that worm in the maror. It was quite it was an uncommon minority. Right? Therefore, kashrut and danger are governed by different laws. You don't have to, from kashrut perspective, you don't have to check it. You don't have to make sure you removed every single thing, unless you want to, but you don't have to because you rely on the majority. Especially the fact that the presence of that insect is an uncommon minority. Right? With me? But danger is not governed by the same halachot. Danger takes into account uncommon minority. Therefore, you have an obligation to make sure that you remove the danger, which doesn't have to be by removing the insect. It could just be by removing the life of the insect, which renders it no longer dangerous. Right? Once you've done that, now you're only left with one issue, which is the kashrut. We left the kashrut, it's different laws. You can follow majority, you don't have to go check it. Okay, that's how it works. So danger is more strict than anything. Okay. However, how strict? And this goes into a fascinating everyday today life issue. As we said before, we have an obligation to look after our life. We have an obligation to live a healthy life. There's a story, I'll just tell you quickly, there's a story of Rabbi Chaim of Brisk. That it was known that Rabbi Chaim of Brisk was a halachic authority, but also a very kind and compassionate person. But the Brisk rabbis were known for being very strict in halachic matters. Even when others were lenient, they were strict. And one year, there was an epidemic that broke out or something, and it was around Yom Kippur, and the whole question of fasting came up, and he became very, very strong that everyone has to eat on Yom Kippur. Everyone. No exception. Everyone's got to eat this Yom Kippur, there's no fasting, no this and that. And everyone was very surprised. First of all, it's not so simple. I mean, you can't just give a blanket rule like that. And particularly him, he was known to be so strict in halakha. You'd think he'd go through every single case that is really dangerous. It was like. So some person came over to him and said, Reb Chaim, why are you being so lenient with Yom Kippur? To which Reb Chaim answered, I'm not being lenient with Yom Kippur. I'm being strict in the mitzvah of health. I'm being very strict, just in a different mitzvah. I'm being strict in the mitzvah of health. That's what I'm doing. Okay. Having said that, by the way, when it comes to Yom Kippur, if you think you shouldn't fast, you should consult both a rabbi and a doctor. So, because you do need to know when you're allowed to, when you're not allowed to. Okay. So it's a really, really important thing. Pikuach nefesh, we call it. Pikuach nefesh, we know that we break the whole Torah, right, to save someone's life, even if it's a suspected danger, right? If someone gets sick on Shabbat, and I just had this a number of months ago. My son was at us for Friday night. It's actually a funny story. We had a bunch of people that we both knew. He moved in for Shabbat. We had a lovely Sudat Shabbat, a couple of young people. They went home, and I don't know, he had some infection, I think, on his arm, and suddenly became very shaky, and it was scary. So we called CHS. 10 minutes later, who arrives? 2 guys. They were at the Shabbat table. They arrived back. They're members of CHS. Why do we call CHS? Because we have a principle of halakha. Infection can be dangerous, especially if you have high fever. I was pretty sure that he's going to be safe, because he probably just needed a bit of antibiotics, that's all it was. But it doesn't matter. In Shabbat, the law is very clear. If it's a safek, even if it's a doubt or remote doubt, Yom Kippur, the same thing. If there's any possible potential of being in danger, you break all Torah. So pikuach nefesh is so important. However, the problem is this. We have to somehow discuss and define what do we mean by not taking risks in order to protect our life. We know that life is, by definition, full of risks. Right? Every time you go in a car, there's a risk. It's a fact. It's a statistical fact. Right? Every time you go on an airplane, there's a lift. So we have a fascinating body of literature with regard to this. It has some very, very halachic implications, which is quite interesting. And I want to go through with you a little because it's very fun. I find it very fascinating. There's something the Gemara calls derech ha'olam. Derech ha'olam means normal living. So for normal living, we're allowed to take risks. What does that mean? Like driving a car, right? There are safety rules in place. You're not allowed to break the safety rules, of course, but right? Speeding is a violation, not only of violating the law of the land, but it's also a violation of halakha, because you're actually putting yourself in danger, right? But there's safety laws. There's laws that are in place to minimize the risk as much as possible. Bottom line is we have to go from place to place. Yes, there's a risk. We have to travel. Travel is a part of normal living. So we do it. Is it associated with risk? Of course it is. But nevertheless, we do it, right? Because it's called derech ha'olam. We go into a car, we go there, you hang around people that, every time you go into a crowd there's a risk, right? Someone might have a contagious disease, you don't know. Derech ha'olam, the way of the world. How do we know this? We know it from a passage in the Talmud, a very simple passage. That you can even take a risk which is more significant than driving a car, for derech ha'olam, for normal living. Because the Talmud talks about 4 people who have to thank Hashem. And today, the way it's done is, it was in the temple times, it was done by a sacrifice. Today it's done by a special bracha. I don't know if you know this bracha, it's called Hagomel. Right? Hagomel, which is it's a bracha you make in shul when you've done certain things. What are they? One is obviously a risk, but that was a risk forced upon a person. If someone was incarcerated in an ancient jail with evil regimes, that was really dangerous. Okay, when you come out, you thank God. You travel in a desert, which is full of elements and full of animals and things like that. So you come back, you have to make Hagomel. Or Yordei Hayam, if a person travels by sea. We're talking about Talmudic times. We're traveling by sea was clearly a risk. Right? Says the Talmud, if you travel by sea, you must make a bracha when you come back. And the 4th one is, if you were dangerously ill and you got better, you have to thank God. Okay, so the prison and dangerously ill, that's understandable. We didn't choose to be sick, we didn't choose to go to jail. But those other 2, you can avoid them. Why do we say that if you travel by sea, you have to thank Hashem afterwards with a special bracha? Just don't travel by sea. Right? If it's got a risk to it, a real risk, then don't do it. Or don't travel in a desert if it's got a real risk. And the answer is no, because people have to travel. There's import, there's export, there's visiting people, just normal life. Normal life, yes, got some level of risk, and perhaps it's not just a 1%, maybe it's even more 1%, maybe it's a bit more significant than that, but nevertheless, derech ha'olam, the way of the world, is considered an acceptable risk to take. Okay. Next area of risk is a very interesting thing that the Talmud talks about. It's something that is not necessarily derech ha'olam, but just everyone does it. Everyone does it. This is a very strange one. We'll see how to define it in a second. Right? But everyone just does it, so we apply the verse, which is in King David said it in Tehillim, Shomer Pta'im Hashem. God protects the stupid. Okay. And since everyone is being stupid because they're doing it, so then God will protect them. Now what does that mean? So it comes from a Talmud, and I don't know what these things mean, but apparently in the Talmudic times it was not good to eat grapes and figs at nighttime. Maybe there's a risk of feeling very unwell. So Rabbi Eliezer says, in the Talmud he says, you know what? Person could do it at night, everyone does it, and Shomer Pta'im Hashem, God will just have to protect the foolish. That's it. What is it actually? What's the definition of that? By the way, we all do this kind of thing. We all eat things that we shouldn't eat. Right? There was a time, and it doesn't apply anymore. I'll tell you why in a second. I'll tell you how you define this area of risk. There was a time when people applied this to smoking. Yeah. When smoking first sort of became a thing, if you look in the responsa, in the halachic response, it's actually very interesting. In very early times, right in the beginning, they actually thought it was healthy for some reason. Obviously, that was a mistake. Okay, so that wasn't. Then there was a long time before there was proper scientific research on this, where everyone knew that it wasn't good for you, but they didn't know how. Is it that? What is it? Is it worse than eating schmaltz herring on Shabbos? I don't know. That's also not particularly good for you, right?
Haven't done the research on schmaltzering.
Sorry? Yeah, they haven't done the research about sharing, so we're just in the, so we're now in the, so God's protecting the foolish. But, right, I mean, if you go to any kiddush, any good kiddush, half the stuff is not good for you. But, right, so they thought it was like, they knew it wasn't good for you, but it wasn't grounds enough to actually write a halachic piece on it saying you're not allowed to smoke. You can say generally you have to look after your health, but everyone was smoking. It was very common to smoke then. I mean, even when I grew up in the very early days, even when you went to yeshivas, I mean, people smoking left, right, and center, right? My grandfather was like a chain smoker. I mean, that's just the fair way. They didn't know it was that bad, and they really started, and they were into it, and they just did it, right? So we applied Shomer P'ta'im Hashem. However, it doesn't apply anymore. Why? Because that area of risk is a risk where people know it's a risk, but they don't know that it's a definite risk. They kind of know it's risky, but not too bad. And that was smoking for a long time. Now that doesn't apply anymore because we now have medical research and a lot of scientific research that smoking is absolutely bad for you. And therefore, and thank God, with the exception of Israel for some reason, but thank God, even in very religious communities all over the world where smoking was quite common, it's down to very, very minimal levels now, because actually there's halachic authorities that write today that actually you're not allowed to smoke today because it's just bad for you. And it's a risk you're not allowed to take, halachically, right? So that's another area. So we have regular living, foolish practice, which is also okay if it's just foolish. And then there's another very, very fascinating one. And this comes from two responsa. You're allowed to engage in activity with increased risk. This is fascinating. It comes from a passage in the Talmud. And I'll tell you two very interesting responses on that. If it's for earning a parnasa. If it's for earning, you're not allowed to take outright risks, but you're allowed to take increased risks. Right? So where does this come from? So there was a great halachic authority, very famous. His writings are used all the time in halachic precedents, called the Noda Yehuda, Rabbi Cheskel Landau. He's buried in Prague. I was actually at his grave almost 2 years ago. And he writes, he was asked the following question, a very fascinating piece. A person wanted to know if they can hunt to earn a living. Hunting was very common in those days. So the piece that he answers is divided into two. First of all, he goes crazy on the practice of hunting. He says, Yitzchak had two sons, Yaakov and Esav. Esav was the hunter. Hunter it's not a Jewish thing at all. It's a terrible sport. It's a terrible this. He got 2 pages. He goes and bashes the hunting. And it's considered risky, and you can get hurt from the animals and all this kind of stuff, which apparently was the case in those days. And then at the end he says, but if you absolutely need it for your parnasa, whatever it was, fur coats, or whatever they were doing it for, and this is your livelihood, you're allowed to do it. Based on the Gemara the Talmud that says that there's a case where the Torah says you have to pay your workers on time, and it's a very strict thing. And those days you talk about workers who are going up trees and doing some risky stuff in the fields. And the Torah says, because you have to know that not just it's important to pay someone on time because it's part of integrity and honesty, but if you delay a person's wages, you're delaying someone who actually risked his life in order to bring you parnasa. So we learn from there that increased risk is okay. So, and the other one, the other more recent response on that topic is from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who I quoted last week. And he was asked about a guy who wanted to join professional sport. I don't remember what the sport was. It was American football or rugby, I don't know what it was. And he said that people get hurt. Bottom line is people get hurt. And he was asking if it's halachically okay. And, not everyone gets hurt. And fascinatingly enough, he said, if it's for a livelihood, if you're getting paid for it, you can. But not if you're not getting paid for it.
So if you're not good enough to get paid for it, you can't do it.
If it's a sport that people get hurt. Right? I'm not going to mix into school sports and football and rugby and all that kind of. It depends. There's very minimal risk. Again, life is full of risks. So it doesn't mean you can't play a soccer match. Every kid can play soccer, right? But more aggressive sports, maybe not. Bungee jumping, I think, is a halachic problem. Parachuting is a halachic problem because there are risks. You're not getting paid for it. You're not earning a living for it. Maybe you'd be allowed to if you were. Maybe the instructor's allowed to it. But I'm not sure if the person's allowed to, right? And there are crazy things that people do that is definitely connected with risks. And I would venture to say, and again, I'm not ruling any specific details today, but I venture to say some of these things have definite halachic problems to it because it's a risk. Right? Now, with all these things, that sometimes the risk level also determines if it's normal behavior or not. Right? So, there's different sources that talk about risk levels, and that's where it becomes complicated because going back to the original question, right? Does the cosmetic surgeon have to reveal the risks to the patient? So in all these things about not taking risks, it does depend a little bit on the percentages. And we find in response to Rabbi Akiva Eger talks about this, the Magen Avraham and Shulchan Aruch, different commentaries talk about this, how you classify the risk. And a lot of times, risk has to do with percentage. Right? So, if a cosmetic surgeon is doing a procedure, right, where, again, we established before that they need consent from the patient, and you would then assume they need consent from the patient because it's not saving their life, just cosmetic surgery, and because he needs consent from the patient, you would also have to inform the patient what they're going through, right, which would then mean you have to reveal the risks. But as a risk that's more less than 1%, considered a risk. That's where the issue. In other words, yes, he would have to divulge. He would have to definitely reveal the risks that are involved. Again, I'm talking now from a halachic perspective. Provided that the risk that we're talking about is a halachic risk. Like for example, what I do know is that 1 in 10,000 is not considered a halachic risk. And if he wouldn't be, I mean, he might want to, but you can give him a website they can go look at it. If 1 in a million dies from this procedure, 1 in a million, I mean, that's a risk that happens all the time. We all take operations. I mean, that's a fact, right? 1 in a million people can definitely be adversely affected from any procedure. And unfortunately, it happens sometimes. You always pray that you're not the one, right? But, so those, like for example, 1 in a million is not considered a risk. You wouldn't even have to divulge that, right? But you'd have to, if it was a surgeon that was worried about his halachic obligation, what he'd have to do is he'd have to talk to someone who's an expert in the field, and he would have to establish what risks, what level of risk, what type of risk and what level of risk is considered a risk. Because if it's a minuscule risk, that even in the laws of danger are not considered a risk. Again, danger is much more stricter than kashrut, for example. But even in danger, we just said, life is full of risks. That's the bottom line, right? When you sell a person a car, you don't have to say he's never driven before. You don't have to say you're a first-time driver. It's my duty to reveal to you that you could have an accident and die. No one does that, right? Because it's just part of life, and it's hopefully very rare, and it's just life. Risk, like life is full of risks. So the same thing with the dangers. It's not the obligation for a surgeon to reveal insignificant risks that halachically are not considered a risk. They're just considered normal living. That wouldn't be obligatory. But if it was something more significant than that can happen more often or is more likely to happen, and it's a procedure that doesn't have to happen if we need complete consent, it would actually also come with the obligation of revealing any significant risks and make sure that the patient is completely aware of that before they start. Okay, so that's that for today. Now, that was just a break. That's last week, and this week we did something very, very different. Next term, again, the 30th of July, we're going to start again, and we're going back to growth, right? Especially that next term we're coming closer to Rosh Hashanah. I mean, I don't want to scare anyone, but yeah, we're going back to coming closer to Rosh Hashanah. And Elul and Rosh Hashanah, which of course is a time of growth. And we'll see you, hopefully we'll see you before, but in the Thursday morning session, we'll see you then. You're very welcome.